Hola,
Hola, ¿qué tal? ¿Cómo andas,
bien,
Ana?
todo bien.
Bueno, buenísimo. Hoy tenemos una nueva transmisión del archivo Redux, si no me equivoco, la número 14 en lo que va del año, eh, de la conferencia que dio Dean Simpson el 28 de abril de 2016. eh, la
Gran año.
conferencia, sí, el nombre de la conferencia era Socioplastic Demographics. Que Deane vino a la escuela a dar un seminario para docentes también, y dio un seminario y una exhibición, incluso del libro que se exhibió en el taller, el mismo libro,
Ujú.
eh, porque digamos,
Sí,
Socioplastic Demographics es un libro que publicó Deane, del cual después dio esta conferencia que vamos a ver hoy, ¿no?
claro, claro, exacto. Sí, 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 vino bien una semana, ¿no? Y pasaron varias cosas. Esta era la que estaba exhibida en el corredor principal y después de la conferencia y bueno, hubo varias otras actividades. Pero sí, la charla de hecho muestra el libro en gran medida y cuenta cómo el research que implica que después eso devenga libro, no tanto no solamente el libro como digamos producto, sino, ahora que lo pienso, que es una manera de investigar, ¿no? Lo que está presentando y que después se
Sí,
ve desplegada.
sí, 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 sí. Es cierto que es como la investigación tiene varios outputs, ¿no? O sea, como el output de la conferencia o del libro, del seminario también que dio. Pero en el centro de la cosa hay una investigación eh, que es interesante. Por un lado, tiene algo como de lo que investiga tiene cierto carácter alternativo, ¿no? O sea, como o del lado
Ujú.
B, por lo menos, de las ciudades, digamos. Básicamente son concentraciones humanas alternativas a las ciudades, pero y muy capitalismo tardío también, en algún sentido, como de los efectos de los efectos del capitalismo sobre las ciudades, o más que, digamos, en el sentido de las grandes concentraciones, ¿no? Como de personas. O sea, la
Ujú.
densidad tiene un rol, me parece, en lo que está investigando, ¿no?
Sí, 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 supongo también como fenómeno, creo que es como una especie de efecto colateral que se convierte en una tipología arquitectónica o algo así, ¿no? O sea,
Claro.
el sistema demográfico tiene una evolución que hace que haya gente que, siendo joven, en el sentido de que tienen, no sé, 55, 60, son gente joven, tienen vitalidad, tienen mucho todavía para hacer, pero están retirados, ¿no? Y entonces eso genera una arquitectura para esa condición que se vuelve como una cosa en sí, ¿no? Y además es como tú dices, o sea, son poblaciones que tienen una homogeneidad, aparte muy extraña si lo piensas, ¿no? O sea, mostraba esas imágenes y eran como todo gente más o menos de la misma edad, más o menos del mismo nivel social, ¿no? O sea, son como lugares muy poco variados en su composición, pero su arquitectura era muy prolífica, ¿no? O lo es, o ahora en este momento no sé en qué estado están esas organizaciones, ¿no?
Sí, sí, me acuerdo una pregunta que le hice a Dean, era si había algún tipo, porque hablaba mucho como el extracto social al cual pertenecían porque digamos, son todas organizaciones que eh, no son autoorganizaciones, si es que eso existiese, pero seguro que no lo son, pero tampoco son formas de organización top-down, digamos,
Ujú.
no sé, como puede ser algún desarrollo urbanístico, por decir algo. Entonces lo que le preguntaba era si había trasvasamientos de algún tipo, de algún mezcla, y me decía que no, que una de las cosas que le había llamado la atención era que no, que digamos, finalmente eran muy homogéneos
Ujú.
eh, sí,
Sí.
y creo que tiene Y en algún sentido son, lo que seguro son como casi que programas arquitectónicos medio bizarros casi, ¿no? O extraños, pero tratados como si no lo fueran en algún punto. O
Claro,
analizados como si no lo fueran, o sea, sin, ¿no? Como, por nombrar alguno, comunidades móviles de retirados en Estados Unidos que van en motorhomes y
mm,
pasan 2 o 3 o 4 o 5 meses en sitios que se organizan de cierta manera, eh,
sí.
¿no? Como tiene
Sí,
eso.
sí, sí. Sí, también bastante programáticos, ¿no? Como un pop extraño o una forma de cultura pop urbana con estas programaciones. Pero también está el tema del golf, ¿no? Como temática de colores, como muy... Siempre que lo pienso, no sé si es así o eso es una cosa que me queda así, como muy de figuras, como de figuras en el sentido como de urbanismo figurativo, que explícito, como si fuera digerido, ¿no? Como cosas que están procesadas y puestas ahí y que generan cero fricción, pero a un cierto corte, ¿no? Porque si no te producen mucha distorsión, ¿no? Si tú te haces un engaging con eso, te genera mucha distorsión. Y no, es muy curioso. No, pensaba una cosa que a lo mejor, nada, que es como Dean, sería como, Dean contando eso, también tiene algo, ¿no? O sea,
Ajá.
digamos, porque es una persona como súper culta, educada, lo está contando con un interés que cubre muchos niveles. O sea, está hablando de estadística, está hablando de sociología, está hablando de arquitectura, está hablando de nada, de como de todas las implicaciones que tiene lo que está estudiando y cómo volverlo una oportunidad arquitectónica, que eso me parece, habla como de un materialismo. O sea, hay una cosa, hay una voluntad de proyecto, ¿no? De algún orden. Y en sí lo está tratando asépticamente al material, como muy Northern Europe. Y creo que por ahí es la única manera de tratar estos materiales, ¿no? ¿O qué, tú qué dices? No sé.
Eh, Supongo que en siempre hay un espacio para hacer un proyecto, digamos, o para volverlo material de proyecto. Entiendo que lo que decís es que como asépticamente es que queda como esterilizado
No,
o
que no
un
tiene
poquito
juicio,
distante.
no, sin juicio, digamos, sin un
Ah,
juicio de valor como en sí, digamos, la cosa como es, como a eso me
yo
refería,
creo,
como con
no, creo que está,
candidez.
creo
Sí,
que sí, sí. O sea, tiene la forma de la candidez, no sé si tiene candidez, digamos, los colores,
eso,
los
sí,
dibujos son eh, casi que convencionalmente cándidos o tiernos. Me
sí,
parece que en eso hay una voluntad, o sea, ese es un nivel de interpretación de los hechos, digamos, funciona interpretativamente, me parece.
sí,
Eh, lo que quizás no se llega a ver es del todo cuál es ese sesgo, digamos, o no decanta, digamos, no tiene como algún tipo de acidez, o lo que se dice, como alguna agudeza, o
claro.
¿no? No sé. Pero,
Sí, sí, es interesante eso. A mí me parece interesante eso, como esa cosa de, bueno, primero porque claramente nos está poniendo delante una cosa súper infantilizante, aceptada, asumida, ¿no? Pero es un material no sé, aparte está publicado por, ¿cómo se dice? Lars Müller, ¿no? O sea, para mí hay algo de esa cosa de las culturas como germánicas y así, que yo creo que al final hay una posición en algún lugar, solo que te tienes como que fijar a ver si la tienen, no te la van a hacer explícita, digamos, ¿no? Pero la manera como se ha tratado el material, porque hablaba de los colores, por ejemplo, en el libro, porque hay mucho cian, magenta. ¿Viste? Hay como colores primarios sin
Sí,
mezcla.
pero con poca saturación, igual, ¿no? O sea, no están full saturación, tienen como...
No, sí, sí, como chillones.
Sí, pero no están un poco rebajados, no sé, tengo esa
Bajados
sensación.
en la tapa, pero ¿viste el uso del color, por ejemplo? Sí, no es un uso del color, no hay amarillos. Bueno, sí había, pero no hay, es más magenta y azul, ¿viste?
Mm,
Y él
sí,
hablaba de eso y de la gráfica, y había mucho puesto en eso, por ejemplo, en el libro.
mm,
Y ahí hay una agenda también, ¿no? Lo hace un poco más serio, le hace un remove, lo dibuja de cierta manera. Hay personitas, pero al lado de las personitas hay estadísticas. No sé, como esa voluntad de dureza, de endurecerlo, pero al mismo tiempo está dibujado de ese modo, ¿no? Y yo me pregunto, ¿qué realmente, ¿no? Adentro de todo eso, ¿qué hay? ¿Qué voluntad de agenda arquitectónica tiene, ¿no? O sea,
sí, no, lo que estaba pensando que quizás es como creo que todas estas preguntas están buenas para entrar con ellas a la conferencia, ¿no? Como esa idea como con esas armas. Pero hay una que me parece que una que se agrega también es si todas estas cuestiones que estamos haciendo, todas estas agendas explícitas, implícitas, el color, cómo se dibuja, cómo se presenta, los niveles de análisis también, porque no, si domestican al material o desencadenan sus monstruosidades,
sí,
sus rugosidades no explícitas. Digamos, teniendo en cuenta que además son los casos elegidos son como protuberancias que salen de formas más establecidas, en el sentido de lo
sí,
alternativo que tienen, digamos. O en ese sentido, las personas que se van en los motorhomes se van de la ciudad o del suburbio o del campo, de lo que fuera. Pero hay como en todos los casos que se elige, hay algún movimiento de salida en algún
sí,
punto.
sí, de migración, hay como una
La pregunta es
inmigración.
si los reinscribe, ¿no? Como si los aplana con la misma forma de medir que se mide a las ciudades, o ¿no? Se los dibuja como se dibuja tal otra cosa, o si el material mismo tiene algún efecto sobre cómo se lo piensa. Eso me parece que, o sea,
Ujú.
lo primero me parece que tiende a domesticar, a volverlo consumible y a volverlo coleccionable, ¿no? Y lo segundo tiende no sé, es un poco más, en principio, incierto, o por lo menos es algo que nos tendremos que apuntar viendo la conferencia, que es lo que tiene interesante, no lo podríamos...
Claro.
eh,
Sí, sí, sí. No, es muy interesante, ¿eh? O sea, realmente, mira, me estoy entusiasmando de hablarlo hacia ahora, porque sí, porque es como una cosa que puede pasar, tiene un nivel de political correctness y de digeribilidad que puede pasar así, pero en realidad tiene muchos niveles y tiene esa cosa como posmoderna, en los colores, en la representación, en la representatividad todo el tiempo de lo mismo.
en la objetualización también, ¿no? O sea, como
También,
las organizaciones están objetualizadas,
exacto.
¿no? Como,
Sí,
eh,
sí.
eh,
Los recursos de esas.
no tengo recuerdos de haber visto plantas, puede que hubiera, pero hay como una
Sí,
axonometría, ¿sí?
más tipológicas por ahí, ¿no? Como más de tipos, como más cataloguísticas que plantas organizativas, ¿no?
Claro,
Me parece.
sí.
Sí. Y sí, no, hay una cosa anecdótica, a lo mejor, y si quieres abrimos a la conferencia, pero en la visita de Deane hizo también un out of time con Ciro y el
Ajá,
lugar al que fueron es la República de los Niños, ahí en La Plata.
claro,
Y
claro,
creo
está
que,
perfecto. Eh,
¿no?
sí, sí, sí,
Es
sí, sí, sí.
clarísimo y nada, me
Sí,
acuerdo
sí. Es que
de
claro, que hay como
este,
la cosa de la miniaturización, ¿no?
y de si esta
Bueno,
especie de niño eterno.
claro.
Sí.
Bueno, Deane es originariamente de Nueva Zelanda. eh, y creo que te comentaba, cuando estuvo acá, fuimos a cenar,
Sí.
después de su conferencia fuimos varios profesores y así, y que en un momento le pregunté cómo era la experiencia de haber nacido y vivido en una isla, y si le daba cierta claustrofobia, y decía que obviamente que viviendo ahí no, pero cuando volvía sí, que ahora no vivíamos ahí. Digo,
Ujú.
porque hay algo de los casos que elige que son como, tienen tendencia a formar islas,
Sí,
¿no? Como comunidades cerradas o aisladas, mediterráneas pero aisladas.
sí,
Este, sí,
total, de verdad. Está bueno eso.
bueno,
Bueno, ahora vamos a ver
perfecto,
cómo va.
dale.
Bueno, Manuel, gracias. Nos vemos la
Igualmente,
próxima.
nos vemos dentro de 2 semanas.
Vale,
Hasta luego.
chao.
Bienvenidos, gracias por estar acá. Por ahí la mayoría lo conocen, pero si alguien no lo conoce, mi nombre es Julián Vara, soy coordinador del Centro de Cultura Contemporánea. Y simplemente decir unas cosas brevemente antes de dejarlo a Santiago Mosela para que presente la conferencia de hoy. La conferencia de Simpson se da en el marco de la creación del Centro de Estudios de Vida es un convenio que tiene varios años y que regularmente el objeto se dedica regularmente el piso sobre norma IR, se dedica varios años, es que se va a volver a dictar en el segundo semestre tradicionalmente, y bueno, este evento para iniciar con ese contexto. Quiero también contar, bueno, ya vieron, tenemos el poco de actividades de la escuela de la cultura del semestre, hay una actividad que dejamos al principio de cada uno para que se lleven una cosa al tanto de lo que vamos a hacer este semestre. Y bueno, solamente Deane, thank you very much for being here. Santiago is going to introduce you, but I just wanted to know that we're very happy that you're here and you made the effort to come all the way from Denmark to share your work with us, so thank you very much. Y bueno, los dejo con Santiago Mosela.
Bueno, ¿qué tal? Buenas tardes a todos. Voy a hacer entonces una pequeña introducción a las series psicológicas, en el marco del cual tenemos el gusto de recibir hoy a Simpson. Y luego voy a hacer una pequeña biografía sobre el invitado de hoy. Sostenibilidad, ecología y ambiente constituyen vectores sobre los cuales las prácticas y los discursos de la perspectiva reciente han ido construyendo un cada vez recurrente marco de relevancia disciplinaria. Desde la búsqueda de soluciones ambientalmente amigables hasta la problematización misma de la idea de arquitectura en relación al medio, desde los discursos donde lo sostenible encuentra una expresión disciplinar vinculada a lo tecnológico, hasta la interpretación misma de la arquitectura como un ecosistema complejo de relaciones entre diversos componentes, pueden ser rastreadas en un número creciente de modo tradicional sobre todos estos temas que den cuenta del estado de progresión de diversas situaciones de debate sobre ellos. Ecológicas de la arquitectura se propone dar cuenta de la diversidad de discursos que conforman actualmente las relaciones singulares entre arquitectura y ecología, analizando las condiciones para la construcción de nuevos campos de formación disciplinar que den cuenta del establecimiento de distintas relaciones entre estas disciplinas. Una guía de exploración del estado de la cuestión de cada una de las temáticas propuestas y sobre todo una modalidad para expandirlas y vertebrarlas. Respecto de Deane, decimos que es arquitecto y urbanista, es profesor asociado de la Royal Danish Academy School of Fine Arts of Architecture, donde dirige junto a Charles Lizard la maestría internacional en urbanismo y cambio social. Ha sido asimismo profesor de la Architectural Association de Londres, de la BAS Version, de la ETH de Zurich y arquitecto asociado en el estudio Deane de Nueva York. Realizó también su maestría en arquitectura en la Universidad de Columbia de Nueva York y se doctoró en la ETH de Zurich. Sus investigaciones centradas en las implicancias arquitectónicas y urbanas del cambio demográfico han sido publicadas en diversas revistas, tales como Harvard Design Magazine, The Architectural Review, AD, Habitare y también en formato libro de Young Goat y Urban Utopias of an Ancient Society. Actualmente está finalizando la edición de distintos volúmenes publicados, uno sobre la sostenibilidad urbana denominada Atlas of the Copenhagen y otro relativo a los problemas de seguridad en las ciudades titulado The City Between Democracy and Security. Esta conferencia abordará las implicancias urbanas y arquitectónicas de una de las transformaciones sociales dominantes que tienen lugar desde fines del siglo XX, el envejecimiento de la población. A partir de la distinción entre las diferentes fases de la edad avanzada, la investigación identifica al grupo conocido como joven viejo como una oportunidad para la realización de experimentos vinculados a formas alteradas de la subjetividad, la colectividad y el medio ambiente. Publicado como Young Old, Urban Utopias for an Ancient Society, el trabajo analiza, a través de fotografías, diagramas, mapas y dibujos, las nuevas formas de organización espacial propias de este grupo social. Dichas organizaciones incluyen los paisajes urbanos continuos más grandes del mundo para comunidades de retiro ubicados en Florida, las organizaciones nacionales de la Casa del Retiro de Europa, en la Costa del Sol, España, la comunidad residencial temática holandesa Huis ten Bosch, ubicada en el sur de Japón, y la comunidad nómada para mayores en los Estados Unidos. A través de la investigación de este campo latente de novedad urbana y arquitectónica, se discutirán las dimensiones tanto de elevación y o de la emancipación vinculadas a estas prácticas, analizando asimismo las características de las formas emergentes de organización espacial conceptualizadas en términos generales como una especie de socio-demografía. Bueno, entonces le damos la bienvenida a Deane. It's a pleasure for us to have you here in Buenos Aires. You're very welcome.
Yeah, first, thanks very much for the invitation to be here from Cyril and William and Santiago. It's really great to be here. I'm going to talk this evening about this project we involved. I would like to talk in a way about something that relates very much between the relationship of demographic change and change in architecture and urbanism. When I'm talking, please interrupt me if it's getting too fast or if you have trouble understanding. Can you hear me at the back? Is it okay? Yeah. Okay, great. So please just let me know if you have questions along the way. Don't be afraid to interrupt. So what I'm interested in is this idea of the relationship between these two things that I've shown here, which I think raise huge questions concerning the social sustainability of our cities, both in a contemporary context but also in a long-term future context. How do we understand this question of aging in relation to how do we ensure that there is some form of, let's say, sustainable future around the relationship between different age groups and how they meet in the city. So the context for this discussion of aging is very much about kind of massive restructuring, of our age composition of our populations, from populations dominated by the young to populations dominated by the old. You see the kind of overlap of these two population pyramids in each case. You see that these are, just if you don't know what a population pyramid is, these are the ages between 15 and 65. So this is 0 up to 100. And then the left side is always males and the right side is females.
You can see that clearly here. So when we look at the situation, just that I quickly made here from Argentina, you see very clearly that there's a quite large shift. A shift when you overlap these two conditions, a situation where we see this as a kind of proportional loss of young or the youth, and a proportional growth of older people. And in a way, the structural change has two essential factors. One is declining fertility, the idea that we are having fewer and fewer children, and you can track, for example, this transformation over time in different contexts. And the second one is the expansion of our longevity, that we are basically living longer. And this situation has been called by different people a longevity revolution. A revolution that is not some kind of Darwinian bioevolutionary transformation. This is not part of our kind of biological evolution, but this is a major shift that is very much connected to a process of industrialization, but also urbanization, which have social transformations attached to them. And what this articulates in this model, which is called the demographic transition, which was developed by Warren Thompson in the late 1920s, it's a model for understanding how our societies shift from ones characterized by high death rates and high birth rates to societies that have low birth rates and low death rates. And in this kind of notion of the demographic transition, what I would like to emphasize is the kind of essential causation that is related to the process of urbanization, that us becoming older is very much connected to us being urbanized. And we see that taking place in different contexts at different times. So in the talk, I'm going to start a little bit here to introduce, kind of quickly, I hope, some background around these demographic changes, but I'll spend most of the time talking about these urban and architectural implications. So what you see here is this kind of idea of a demographic transition, where you see in the more developed countries on the bottom left, a situation where death rates drop first, followed by birth rates, and you see in the more developed countries a much earlier point of this process, which corresponds to urbanization and industrialization, and we see in the less developed countries this happening much later and much quicker. You can see that on the top part of this slide, where this is the birth rate for the UK, the death rate for the UK immediately below it, and then this is, for example, Mexico, with a birth rate and a death rate that you see here. So this would be just to give examples around different settings. And this demographic transition from, let's say, societies that were more rural and agricultural based toward urban industrialized ones is related to a discussion of high birth rates in terms of many children being required for farm labor. So in a way, families would try to have many children so that they would have more labor on the farm. There was no or little family planning, and there was very much religious and social encouragement for having many children. And this was a driver for high birth rates. The high death rates were related, obviously, to things like disease, to poor medical knowledge, to high rates of death in childbirth, but also things like famine and poor food supply. And when we see this kind of movement toward the early stages of urbanization and industrialization, we see in a UK context very much, let's say, incredible challenges and problems in this transitionary period. For example, we see the cholera epidemic in the 1850s, and we see here this leading, and in response to this epidemic, to major advances in urban infrastructure, which of course had major public health improvements, which, let's say, eliminated or very much reduced diseases like cholera. We see also connected to this process of industrialization, things like the expansion of the rail network and steam trains, also actually having a huge impact on food supply and food distribution, where food was much more quickly and more easily distributed and brought to the centers of the population. And of course, connected to this shift toward low birth and low death rates, we also see a kind of context where various developments, such as let's say developments in vaccinations, developments in medical understanding, but also developments, for example, in family planning technologies, from the invention of rubber or later silicone condoms or oral contraceptives, and so on. These things would have quite large impact on birth rates. And what I think is interesting is when this kind of longevity revolution is discussed together with a kind of another shift, which was a major shift, which is actually the emergence of retirement as an institution in the more developed countries, which of course started with Bismarck in 1889 in Germany with the first state pension plan. And this kind of development of retirement as an institution had a massive impact on the role of older people in the labor force and became, let's say, extremely successful as an institution. At the beginning, when retirement was introduced, it was much more stigmatized. Many people didn't want to retire because they were seen as idle by the society, but many developments also supported, let's say, the kind of development of retirement as something that was popular or sought after. And we see this very clearly in this kind of development during this time. So in a way, these two shifts that I've described, one is this notion of a kind of longevity revolution, another one, the development of retirement as an institution, result not only in the kind of quantitative change in the sense that we have more and more older people and more of them are retired in the more developed countries. It also results in major qualitative change in old age, which has been theorized by these two. The man on the left here is a British social historian, Peter Laslett, and the woman on the right, Bernice Neugarten, is a very important American gerontologist. And what they both developed, and Neugarten introduced this idea of the young old, and Laslett developed it in a kind of more elaborate way later. What they argue is that we face, after the middle part of the 20th century, a situation where we have a new kind of narrative in our lives, a kind of new life phase, which Neugarten refers to as the young old, which is basically the idea that for the first time we see old age bifurcating into an idea of a younger old and an old old. The old would be closer to how we, let's say, traditionally understood old age, which was a notion of a dependent and alien old age in which we see decline both physically and mentally. Whereas this young old represents a period in which older persons are free of these kind of disabilities, and at the same time they're free from the responsibilities of the first and second age. The first age responsibilities being education and socialization into society, and the second age being about, for example, work, child care, and so forth. And so in many ways, this kind of liberation has been described as a kind of late freedom by Peter Laslett. It's been described as something which, let's say, articulates a whole set of new conditions for society. And the implications of this kind of major change have been discussed in different ways, largely in terms of a notion of crisis. A crisis in this case, which we are all familiar with in discussion, which is the idea of a crisis concerning the economic sustainability of the nation state, associated with the idea of a crisis of dependency. The notion that we see in the most extreme form in Japan is the situation where we have more and more older people in relation to fewer and fewer working age people. A question of how do we support, how does the working age population support such a large number of retirees? A second crisis, which is closer to a kind of architectural and urban discussion, is a crisis related very much to a kind of quantitative understanding of our cities or our environments, which we could see as a kind of programmatic crisis. A crisis around the functional sustainability of our urban cities. In this case, the idea of the cities that were designed very much for youth being dominated increasingly by the old. And what I'm interested in let's say, is a kind of third format of crisis. What I would argue is a crisis of precedent. In this sense, related back to Peter Laslett and Bernice Neugarten's argument, is the notion that this particular social group of the young old of the third age is entirely unprecedented in human history prior to the middle of the 20th century. What that means is that by definition, this new group is experimental in terms of developing, let's say, it's obligated in a way to actually try to produce new forms or new ecologies of subjectivity around the individual, emerging forms or technologies around social collectives beyond the nuclear family, also emerging forms or ecologies of environment. And that's the part that I'm most interested in. So in many ways, these represent experiments in terms of how should one live, with whom one should live, and in many cases in what context one should live. And these range from, as I mentioned, discussions around subjectivity, the idea of the individual. In this case, experiments that we see in the early retirement communities in the US, such as Sun City, which are exploring the idea of a newly formed leisure subject, the idea of someone in a permanent state of leisure. This kind of idea of an individual subjectivity also plays out at a kind of bodily level in the idea of a kind of biotechnical arrangement, the body in a constant state of adjustment, correction, and tuning in response to this notion of gradual decline. And similarly, we can talk about the young world through the terms of experimental forms of social collectivity. In this case, models of social collectivity beyond the nuclear family or beyond the workplace. And we see here, for example, the senior games opening at the villages, where we have the senior cheerleaders who are all over 55, but sorry, it's hard to see a little bit. And this kind of question around emerging experiments in social collectivity place, let's say, other types of social arrangements into focus around how society, but also the urban setting is organized. So in this case, this is a list, a selected list of over 1,200 clubs at the villages of Florida, which is one of the communities I'm going to talk about, where we can understand the kind of importance of, let's say, social interaction structured around a club, rather than the workplace or the idea of the nuclear family. And then, of course, what I mentioned is that I'm going to talk more about this idea of emerging experiments for this new age group around urbanism, where we see new environmental ecologies of agricultural urbanism that explore what this kind of this new situation opens up. And in many ways, collectively, we can say that what I argue in the book, in a way, is how these different experiments operate as a kind of counter-discussion or counter-discourse to the discourse that is dominated largely by the notion of older people in terms of the notion of the oldest old or the fourth age. So when we discuss aging and the notion of seniors in society in relation to architecture and urbanism, this discourse is often dominated by the column that we see on the left, the idea of how we address institutionalized care, how do we address aging in place, how we, let's say, engage in a discussion around, for example, the multi-generational household. And my interest is in a way that the explorations that I've been looking at through the young old in particular represent a kind of additional or supplementary discourse around an entirely different set of logics, ethoses, scales, and conceptions, and also urban and architectural formats. So one of the major things I would argue in this research is a shifted scale from dealing with aging as an architectural problem into where it's dealt with as an urban problem, as the discussion of producing cities, which I'll talk more about shortly. So what I'm trying to do in this research is also not only work with this discussion of social aspects, but very much try to exploit architectural and urban tools to document and understand a set of territories, spaces, and objects that represent alternative forms of organization, composition, as well as aesthetic texture. And these are documented through a set of drawings, maps, and so forth that try to capture this relational set of scales that play out these different settings. From, as I said, from territories down to objects, but also in looking at different conditions, trying to dissect different kind of architectural and urban situations. Also to try to tell the kind of temporal transformations that take place, as well as trying to unfold how these different environments have been exploited through the logics of the market to be produced in a way as products to be consumed not only as housing but as lifestyles, which I'll talk a little bit more about. So the study, as I mentioned earlier today around the exhibition, is organized around 4 contemporary case studies, which I'm going to introduce briefly. The first one is what has been known as the retirement home of Europe, which is Costa del Sol on the coast of Spain, which has become, particularly since the 1970s, a major hub of Northern and Western European retirement migration, where we see large numbers of European retirement migrants moving south which has produced a kind of extraordinary growth. We see from the mid-1950s very little urban material to, by the end of the 20th century, an extraordinary massive expansion to produce effectively a kind of linear post-metropolitan condition that is effectively a kind of continuous urban strip along the length of Costa del Sol, which is quite extraordinary when you fly over it. And we can see this, let's say, connected to many different logics. Let's say the connection or the integration of Spain into the EU, which expands, let's say, the application of pension issuing to people who are, for example, in the UK, are able to be in Spain and receive their pension. It's also about accessibility to healthcare under expanded EU healthcare laws. It's about also relational exchange rates between the former British pound and the former Spanish peso. It's about all of these different aspects which, let's say, represent a kind of calculus of expansion in this area, around which the major kind of urban figure is the figure of the urbanization, which, excuse my bad Spanish pronunciation, but these are basically these bubbles that you see as one of three major ecologies. Here we see Costa del Sol broken into three parts, just so you know. And you can see that this is kind of a, let's say, urban ecology that's made up of three different ecologies. The top one, which we can understand as the original towns or fishing villages that emerged as very small towns or villages from the 1950s. Then we see a kind of infrastructural layer around the tourism sector, which developed particularly from the 1970s onwards. And then this layer at the bottom, which is the layer dominated by retirement migrants. And these are the urbanizations where you see various bubbles or enclaves. Just to give you one example of what one of these looks like, they have different scales. Basically, they are consisting of largely housing, in many cases also recreational infrastructure, commercial centers, and so on. Here you see some mixture between the housing and a kind of commercial hub, which also has restaurants and pubs and so on. Another example where you see mostly dominated by housing, and here we see housing related to this kind of recreational infrastructure. What you see here is each of these dots represents, I think it's 20 non-Spanish European Union citizens in the official census. We see them dominantly occupying these urbanization areas. What is particularly important, I believe, in discussing these areas is that they're dominated by single nationalities. So you have particular urbanization enclaves that are dominated by British retirement migrants, some dominated by Germans, some by Nordic retirees, which produces a quite remarkable situation, a situation in which these environments function very much as lifestyle products which collapse the exoticism of the destination of being in Spain, together with the familiarity of the home settings of the original home countries of these migrants. So what this does is effectively produces a third culture in between the kind of Spanish condition and, for example, a British condition, which allows these residents to kind of curate their own relationship to this place and also their own identity. It becomes effectively a curatorial project where at one level they're able to live entirely within the context of other British retirement migrants of the same, roughly the same age and the same interests in many cases, and eat the same food as they would in their home context, watch the same television, and so on and so on. At the same time that they're able to, let's say, mediate their own relationship to the actual setting. And what I argue is that this represents a kind of elastic subjectivity in which, for example, many of the British migrants are quite skeptical of the British tourists that come and see themselves as much more, let's say, cultured and integrated into the Spanish setting. Yet at the same time they move in between these different roles. And this has a kind of architectural correlate where we see, in this case, the kind of exoticism of the Spanish exterior of this Pueblo Mediterraneo style, as it's called, and then you see the Irish pub interior. And this kind of plays out in quite radical ways around a kind of schizophrenia between the kind of extreme theming of this exoticism addressing the permanent visitor or the permanent migrant, and on the other hand, this kind of familiarity of the home setting. And you see, I won't go into this kind of weird, extremely themed objects. Another example, and there are many themes that overlap between these different pieces, and I'll talk more about that as we go through. The next example is Bosch, as Santiago mentioned, which is a Dutch-styled theme park located in the south of Japan, which is being described by a British sociologist, Joy Henry, as the theme park to end all theme parks. And this operates very much according to the logic of the Japanese cultural park, which is based on a kind of transposition of foreign objects, whether it's an urban space or an architectural object or a landscape, from an original country into a Japanese park setting, which were developed in particular during the 1980s at the kind of height of Japanese affluence, when Japan was very interested in foreign cultures, and in combination, let's say, or collision with the problem that in Japan you get very few days off. So this is a kind of, let's say, convenient way, developed as a convenient way for Japanese people to encounter foreign cultures on their own terms. And we see that in the case here at Bosch, which was based around a Dutch theme, based on the history of this part of Japan, where during the Edo period, Japan cut itself off from the rest of the world, except made a deal with the Netherlands, where it was allowed to continue to trade as long as the Dutch did not try to be missionaries. So this part of Japan still has Dutch words in its kind of local dialect. So there is some kind of, let's say, local relation to this culture. And what we see is this kind of very precise copying and repositioning of objects. We see, for example, on the left the original setting in the Netherlands, and on the right its new setting in Japan. We see quite specific transformations that take place where, for example, the tower, the Dome Tower had to be shown because of the flight paths of military aircraft around this location. Obviously, there's transformations in the kind of programmatic composition of these buildings as well. And we see that play out in this kind of very weird sort of Frankensteinian collision of these different Dutch iconic architectures and urban spaces, which are arranged and become, let's say, very important spaces in the context of the larger park. And in that sense, what interests me in particular about this particular site is the fact that they're actually a kind of residential complex that is attached to this theme park. And this is basically predominantly occupied by Japanese retirees who are living in a Dutch-styled canal landscape, housed immediately adjacent to the rest of the cultural theme park. And you see that here in this kind of canal house structure. And these houses are not only, let's say, very particular in their relation to nature, as the residents refer to this relationship to water, but also they have a very specific, let's say, cultural twist in the way that, let's say, they use different building materials that are not observing the local kind of propensity for earthquakes. They use kind of European architectural tropes that are not commonly used in a Japanese context, particular ways to use fireplaces, for example, the way that Western arrangements or European arrangements are used around much of the organization of the house. So it was very interesting when interviewing these residents to understand how they live and how they use this space, and also how they relate to this notion of culture, whether they understand themselves living in Dutch environment, or whether they're actually living in a part of Japan that is just being transformed. What's interesting about the relationship of their use to the park that I tried to show in this diagram is that they live in this area called Vasudhan here, and they use the spaces of this park on an everyday basis. So they use the spaces of the stores to buy different kinds of food. They use the public spaces to sit and watch people who are visiting the park. They also, for example, use the water where they go kayaking or canoeing, boating. So basically this kind of theme park structure becomes, let's say, the major public space that they use on an everyday basis. And for me, this represents the intersection of two, let's say, important transformations. On the one hand, the notion in a Japanese context where there's extreme demographic aging, of a kind of transformation of the theme park to a demographic reality where the larger population in Japan is very much an older population rather than a younger one. and at the same time a kind of understanding of retirement and retirement activities through the logic of entertainment and theming, according to the logics of the entertainment industrial complex. So let's say that this kind of more precisely articulated could be understood as the idea of the programmatic transformation of the theme park from roller coasters for the young to cultural experiences for the old, and the transformation of the retirement community from a form of rest home into a kind of event landscape designed to discipline and dispose of leisure time. And this has a similar, let's say, kind of elastic relation between where these residents position themselves in the way that they describe to me how, for them, living in this environment allowed them to, let's say, in an optional way, disconnect from some of the obligations that they felt, that they would have felt otherwise in another kind of more, let's say, traditional Japanese community. The next case is the senior RV community in the RS, in the US, which has been estimated to number between 2 and 3 million people, that produces a kind of nomadic network urbanism, a way of life constituted through the abandonment of a kind of sedentary lifestyle, which is downsized towards the idea of a nomadic life on the road. And this is sustained, let's say, by a kind of paradox, the idea of giving up one's own home. In response to that, there's a kind of compensatory domesticity, the idea that if one gives up a home, at the same time when one looks inside of these vehicles, there's a kind of extraordinary homemaking desire that plays out in all of the tropes of the kind of American middle-class suburban home that we see as the kind of predominant original setting for these RVers. This doesn't only play out on the interior, but also plays out on all of the tropes of the exterior, where the kind of outdoor space is colonized and organized according to, let's say, the idea of a front and a back parking place, a space for dining, and so on. The RV community in the US is organized around two major infrastructural logics. One is a more immaterial logic, which is based on the development of satellite internet technology in the early 2000s that became commercially available during that period, which becomes, let's say, the dominant infrastructure to organize the social staging of this community. And you can see the dishes on top of the vehicles that are all faced toward the southern sky that are able to access quite fast internet connections, and these are basically connected in many ways to a number of clubs. And these are some of the logos from different clubs that range from the Good Sam Club that you see on the top left, that has over 1 million members. The Escapees Club has around 120,000 members, I think. And then we see many other groups represented. For example, LOW is Loaders on Wheels, which is an RV singles club where people online organize dates to meet up in these different contexts. And this technology has been used in different ways. What I think is really extraordinary is how location technology has been used to support a kind of social connectivity in these groups. So you can zoom into this map, and each one of these satellite dishes corresponds to a member of this particular club, where you can actually leave, you see messages that are left to actually meet up with one another. And this not only has a kind of seasonal aspect, but it also has a very strong, let's say, social aspect where instant activities, where one might suddenly find 150 or 1,000 RVs in one place that is being orchestrated over this platform. You see, for example, what that means also seasonally, where we see vehicles concentrated in the south during the winter and spread out and toward the north in the summertime. This is from this kind of locational platform. The second, let's say, form of infrastructure is a more obvious kind of material infrastructure, which is, of course, the American highway and road system, together with various kinds of formal and informal parking areas, which in a way draws a different map of the territory of the US. In this case, a territory organized, of course, around the road network, but also around the concentration of parks, and as I'll explain a little bit more about shortly, concentrations of Walmart parking lots. And so we can see these different kinds of, let's say, spatial manifestations of this physical infrastructure, from, in this case, quite elaborate and quite formalized parks, which are organized, in this case, in Palm Springs around the golf courses, or kind of compressed golf courses and recreational facilities, to much more informal camping sites where we see very large clusterings of RVs in the desert that I mentioned earlier today when we were talking about the exhibition. In the case of Quartzsite, in the middle of the Arizona desert, which during the winter, the summer months, it's extremely hot. It's over 40 degrees Celsius here, and the summertime population is about 2,000 or 3,000 people. And during the winter, in January, it explodes to several 100,000 people that we see in these dots, which are RVs parked in the desert, in various arrangements where we see different kinds of suburban arrangements where we see clusters of different groups that you see here, to quite organized group arrangements where they arrange to meet up and make these quite specific spaces where activities are arranged around the center of this corral. But also, this not only takes place outside of the city, but also in the city, in this context, in this notion of Walmart's role in supporting parking of RVs overnight in their parking lots. So Walmart actually has made a kind of unofficial deal with the RV community, where if these RVs are parked on the far side of the parking lot, they're actually allowed and supported to park overnight, and usually the RVs are going into the Walmart and buying things, and this sets up some kind of reciprocal sort of squatting relationship. And what it's used for by many RVs is an inexpensive way to travel long distances and stay overnight without having to pay for these kind of parking areas that I showed you earlier. So when you put these two infrastructures together, what I think is kind of remarkable about it is that it produces a kind of social connectivity or social density which is connected socially as it is spatially sparse or disconnected. It produces a kind of spontaneity in urbanism and potential to produce, let's say, large clusterings of individuals with very little notice. And this plays out, for example, in situations like during Hurricane Katrina and immediately after Hurricane Katrina, there was a very large organized gathering of RVers who reacted and came to the south, to the coast, to the Gulf Coast, to actually try to help in the kind of relief effort, both to offer beds, but also to try to, let's say, clean up and contribute labor to the rebuild effort. The fourth and last case study is the Villages of Florida, which is the world's largest retirement community of a little bit over 115,000 inhabitants who are legally supposed to be over 55 years of age, or at least one person in each household. And in many ways, what I think is interesting is that it represents, let's say, a development of the original idea of communities such as Sun City, where it takes to another level a discussion of the American retirement community based on the idea of the active adult. The active adult is a kind of euphemism for the senior in this context. And what is quite extraordinary is the scale of this development. You see Sun City immediately next to it, which was formerly the world's largest retirement community. You see the area of Manhattan, just to give you some sense of the relationship to the municipality of Brooklyn. I don't know if you know, but it's a fairly large area that's covered, which at the same time has become extraordinarily profitable for the developer, and represents America's fastest growing community for the last several years. And the Villages, of course, is developed out of a kind of similar lifestyle-centered product as places like Sun City, which revolve around things like golf courses and recreational amenities. But its name, the Villages, emerges from a basic defensive structure. The idea that you see here of the gate, or the gated security, is basically the Villages is constituted out of over 50 individual gated communities that are all, let's say, operated and run by the developer of the community. And what we see here is in a way, a kind of structure that is based very much around an infrastructure for leisure. So you see, for example, the golf course, these kind of whirling territories you see here is a kind of structure of golf courses. We see also structures of things that are called downtowns. You see here and here. And then we see kind of areas of housing. We see the structures of these villages with their recreational amenities that are centered around these logos that you see. For example, here, or here, or here. So we can understand this urbanism in many ways as a kind of infrastructure of leisure, are organized around this notion of a kind of utopia of the suburban detached dwelling, organized around kind of sculpted man-made lawns and ponds and so forth. So you see here this kind of structure. You see the gate and the fencing and the guardhouse. Here you see, for example, one of the smaller recreational centers. And in many ways, there are many similarities to other American master plan communities, in the sense that they're organized around the same legal constructions of covenants, conditions, and restrictions, or CC&Rs. So we see here some of these CC&Rs where you see the typical control of outside animals, for example, Christmas decorations or decorations on the lawn. But also important here is the idea that persons under the age of 19 are only allowed to visit for up to 30 days a year. And if one goes beyond that, one is heavily fined and in certain cases can potentially be thrown out of the community. So we can see that in this case it's adding very much strong age controls to the kind of classic CC&Rs of American master plan communities. Also the villages, as I mentioned, organized around these downtowns. They're called downtowns, which are basically entertainment and retail centers within the community where you can see them here, where there's a kind of center that represents centers for entertainment, where they have nightly music, dancing, and happy hour every night. The happy hours, I think, 4 or 5 hours, it lasts for. And you see here also a connection of restaurants and commercial spaces together with, in this case, the sales center for selling this product to new customers. So the director of design of the villages talks about the idea that the villages, downtowns, are not only conceived as meeting spaces for the social engagement of the community, but also actually act as staging sites for this lifestyle of entertainment and leisure, which are intended to facilitate the sales of homes to continue the expansion of the villages. So what you see here are the kind of homestays where people will stay for 1 week on a cheap deal, to be having a promotional package to buy into the village's lifestyle, and over here they spend their time dancing and drinking at the downtown happy hour here. So in a way, collectively, I'm talking now generally about these cases. Collectively, as I mentioned, what I'm arguing is that the right-hand column of these examples, of course, represent extreme cases of how the market has attempted to exploit this new social group of the young old, as a huge potential, let's say, a huge potential for, from a supply side profit, a huge potential, let's say, to try to supply an idealized lifestyle product to seniors who are in a situation, let's say, of having a certain realization, for example, around the size of their own home, or it's getting too large, around a number of push and pull factors that relate to the idea, in an American context at least, where one reaches retirement, one is also commonly, let's say, evaluating if the living situation or housing situation is an appropriate one. And in many ways, what I would say is how one would start to, let's say, interpret or react to these phenomena. I would argue that one of the key, let's say, terms with which to interpret this would be a kind of ambivalence. An ambivalence that, from my perspective, is about understanding these environments on the one hand as a kind of fundamental escapism, and on the other hand as a kind of emancipatory project, a kind of utopian project, which of course has very much two sides. In terms of, let's say, the idea of understanding this notion of escapism in this particular environment, I would argue that this kind of young old urbanism, if we could call it that, can be understood at the intersection of demographic transformation, let's say aging, together with the emergence of neoliberal spatial practices that articulate and let's say support this kind of escapism, or what one could call a kind of abandonment of responsibility. Which we could say represents in some ways a kind of vision into an endgame or limit condition of a kind of continued unevenness, fragmentation, and sorting of our contemporary societies. We could see this as a kind of fourfold dystopia, a dystopia of segregation, in this case, in which we add age to other forms of existing segregation. We see this as a dystopia of securitization, in which, let's say, gating has become, let's say, the dominant logic around how the retirement community relates to its surroundings. Let's say dystopias of privatization. I won't go into a lot of detail, maybe a little bit toward the end, around how also these products represent very specific transformations of citizenry and democratic processes which are based around how private governance has emerged in contexts like the US or in Spain. And lastly, a dystopia of denial, the idea of denial of the realities of this final stage of life. What I'm talking about here is the idea that most of these environments are products which are based on not having older, frail, and sick older people living in them. Effectively, places like the villages invest their own image in avoiding any association with older people who are frail or limited or suffering from dementia. The whole idea around the presentation of this product is around active adults who are healthy, active, social, and so forth. So these are quite problematic when we discuss, let's say, the kind of whole question of connection to place, social networks, and so on, around needing to move out once one actually is in this difficult period. So I would argue this is very much about this notion of a kind of escapism, but also kind of deeply problematic strain that we can understand these examples. And what I would refer to, if we discuss, just to go into detail maybe in one of these areas about segregation, what I would do is place this kind of development of these segregated communities in a context, together with Sun City, around a kind of key shift in late capitalism, a shift in which the way that products were designed and conceived, as well as produced and manufactured and marketed, underwent a kind of radical transformation. And this kind of moment of shift is connected to the work of Wendell Smith, who's a marketing theorist, who argued in this essay a kind of key shift in paradigm, a paradigm shift that he described as a shift from, instead of trying to sell products to a kind of full layer of the mass market cake through mass marketed and standardized products, he argued rather instead we should be trying to market toward much more smaller segments of the population and trying to capture a much deeper slice of that particular market through making much more tailored products that would address those specific needs and desires of those smaller groups of like people. In many ways, of course, this is connected also to a kind of whole discussion around transformations in production and industry. So we can understand the shift from the layer of the top of the layer on the left to the deep slice on the right, through the example, the emblematic example of the shift from the idea here of the mass-produced and mass-marketed product of the Model T Ford that could be bought in any color as long as it was black, to a more contemporary paradigm where the user of the car is designed first, in this case the avatar of Antonella, I think her name is, who is the user of this Ford Verve, around whom this entire product is designed and developed through extensive market research around the numbers of this particular segment, their purchasing patterns, their own interests and desires, and so forth. And of course, this whole idea of market segmentation has become quite developed, let's say, industry. It's become highly sophisticated in the way that it meets together various kinds of large data together with GIS to become a way, let's say, in a product like this one, which is called Prism, which divides the American consumer up into 66 pieces, into 66 of these names like the Young Gujarati or the Heartlanders or Kids in Cul-de-sacs. These are names which refer to particular consumer segments, which what I've done is try to map out these 66 positions as they are conceived according to different age groups, according to different income groups, and according to where these people live, whether they live in a city or whether they live in a rural area. So here you see the 66 segments. The green ones are the older age group, and here you see vertically income, age, and urbanicity. And within that grid, you get all of these spots which represent different positions and different names. And these tools, in a way, have been used predominantly by different, let's say, suppliers or companies, as well as marketing groups, to try to read the city. What these instruments try to do through connecting to GIS is that they try to read homogeneity of single segments amongst a heterogeneous city. So we can understand this as reading or scanning for homogeneity within the heterogeneous city. But what I'm interested in is how, let's say, problematic it means to actually produce a situation where these particular tools and segments are used instead of trying to read homogeneity within heterogeneity. They're actually used as a tool to write entirely, let's say, segment-specific urban formats, which actually produce a kind of spatial manifestation of a segment. A situation in which, through this kind of demographic specialization, in these kind of figures we see, in particular if we look at Sun City, Arizona, or the villages of Florida, out of these 66 segments we see a domination of one or two of these segments. So we would see a town of roughly 115,000 people. In the case of the villages, where you would live your everyday life and your everyday situation in contact with 1/66 of, let's say, a cross-section of American consumers. We would see that playing out in the attempt here to kind of overlay these segments over these kind of urban settings. And what is extraordinary about this, let's say, development is that this is extraordinarily successful economically or financially. In the case of the villages, when you put this together with how the local media works, the villages developer actually owns all of the local media, and therefore they're able to sell extremely lucrative and successful advertising time to firms who are selling products to 1/66 of the population. We understand this kind of concentration, where we can understand a kind of extraordinary efficiency of advertising to an environment which is basically a pure consumer who is going to consume those products. That not only, let's say, plays out in the ownership of the developer on, let's say, commercial real estate, in the media you see here, it's also they own all the golf cart dealerships, all the banks for giving out mortgages. It goes on and on, and this is what I'm talking about with this extraordinary distortion of private governance. They also control the political debate through the newspaper, in which they control the discussion of local politics. Through that control of the local debate in the media, they've been able to actually gain complete control of the larger county government, and through that they've been able to direct the resources of the county government into their own community. So we see kind of amazing developments through this idea of a kind of market segment becoming spatialized, becoming a political instrument, becoming a kind of economic instrument, through, in this case, the kind of Darth Vader of the villages, Gary Moss. And of course, this kind of plays out in many ways. It also plays out in this kind of local political condition around environmental stewardship, in the sense that, for example, the huge debates over water resources have led to the villages, let's say, using a lot of water. It's starting to produce these kind of extraordinary sinkholes where parts of the villages get sucked into the ground. So this is kind of the bad part of the story, you can say. But I think on the other side, I think what is important to discuss and let's say be open to is another part of the project associated with this notion of young urbanism, which I would argue is very much connected to emancipatory ambitions. Emancipatory ambitions which are very connected to the idea of utopia. Utopia which takes on many different forms. For example, the kind of notion of climatic utopia that plays out in the idea of the geometry of paradise, as Juan Carlos Casado, the Spanish architect, has written about, which is the idea of the potential for migration into this geometry of paradise. We can talk about a utopia of the vacation that never ends, the utopia of youthfulness that is, of course, predicated on the elimination of youth at the villages, the utopia of golf, Costa del Sol, Costa del Golf, which we see playing out in a very strong way in this kind of territory, to the utopia of European refinement and high culture that we see playing out in the dreams of the Japanese retiree at House Ten Bosch. Also the suburban utopia of culture of urban level amenities within the kind of single family house suburban area. And then also in the context of the urban community, a kind of dual utopia of the sublime of nature and the freedom of the road that is associated with this whole kind of community. And what I think we can say is, while these, let's say, utopian frameworks are in a certain way rather banal, we see them perhaps not as the utopia that had been considered in other productive periods of utopian thinking. At the same time, we can also see many resonances with the kind of historical discussion of utopia. We can see, for example, in the work of Archigram from the 1960s and David Green's Instant City and Log Plug projects, we see very strong, let's say, resonance in the idea of Archigram's, let's say, critique of the permanent, static and hierarchical city, which could be, in their vision, reconfigured through technological infrastructure. In their case, the infrastructure of the automobile, together, of course, with the infrastructure of the log plug, which would be a kind of fiberglass log that would be distributed out in the landscape, which you can kind of see. Actually, I don't think they collaged it into that image. I have another image of it, but you see here that this was a site in which you would be able to connect to electricity, to water, to waste, but also what you see here is called an international information hookup, which we can imagine as a kind of precursor to the internet, where in this case, of course, in many ways, there's very much the notion that technology could allow one to enjoy qualities of urbanity in an entirely rural or bucolic natural setting. And in this case, we see very much this kind of resonance with the RV community. I think what's also interesting to discuss is how these utopias also fold onto themselves when they start to become somehow distorted. So at the Villages of Florida, we see how the idea of the vacation that never ends, which is one of the ways that it's sold and represented, the vacation that never ends collides together with the idea of the physical isolation in this urban territory. So here's Orlando, and here is Osala, and in the middle here is the Villages, and this is about an hour's drive here. So you have around 150,000 people, which due to this kind of age segregation and the isolation of this development has actually led to another and new market for work for retirees. So many retirees in the Villages actually go back into work in this kind of vacation retirement utopia, which is represented in two ways. For many of them, this is represented as a way of avoiding boredom, so they do it for social interaction and for pleasure. And others do it actually for economic sustenance, or to sustain themselves economically. And this is an example of an electronic organ store that was run by a retired police detective and a retired school teacher who are now organ professionals that we see here. And I think aligned to this, let's say, kind of utopian discussion is very much the idea of the notion of a kind of experimentation and innovation that takes place, or invention that is a result of this lack of precedent, crisis of precedent. And that these are also, let's say, a product of kind of instrumentality of these urbanisms. So the idea that these are directed toward a very, very specific group, and this urbanism is becoming very instrumental in addressing them. So, for example, one of these novelties or inventions is the kind of extensive use of golf carts, not only by people who golf, but actually by the full population of the villages. And it's estimated that I think more than 3/4 of the villagers have immediate access to a golf cart within their household. So you see this kind of elaborate infrastructure of tunnels, bridges, different speed interaction with automobile traffic. We see the emergence also of kind of architectural mutations, in this case the golf cart garage. We see also this kind of expand into a kind of cultural phenomenon at the villages around representational culture in relation to previous careers. So the previous career of, in this case, the kind of vehicle customizer is played out through these vehicles. Also we see, for example, club activity around golf cart drill formation. We see world records for world's longest golf cart parades. And what is, let's say, relevant to discuss around the golf cart is a discussion around the relationship of mobility to these urban structures in relation to this specific group. So these retirees, who for many are becoming, let's say, less confident driving, this represents a kind of intermediate form of mobility that for them allows them to, let's say, travel great distances, which are quite large at the villages, but it also allows them, if they've lost their driver's license through bad eyesight, they can still drive a golf cart. So this becomes a kind of intermediate form of mobility between the performance of an electric wheelchair or mobility scooter on the one hand and an automobile on the other. Another, let's say, development is, or invention at the villages is the idea of this is an environment that is entirely themed. It's themed by, let's say, it's comprehensively designed to perform according to its owner as the Disney World for active retirees, where your dreams come true. And in this case, the villages has been designed by a theme park designer. The gentleman on the left, Gary Mark, is actually, his background is in designing, in this case, Universal Studios theme park. So based on literally copying one environment into a kind of theme park setting, which of course is a similar idea of Walt Disney in Main Street, USA, which was based on Disney's childhood home, of transforming Marceline, Missouri into a theme park environment in Anaheim, California. And in the case of the villages, the theme is Florida's friendliest hometown. The idea is that the villages should represent the hometown in which all of these retirees grew up, which for many of them predominantly was a small Midwestern American town. And according to these logics of theming and theming entertainment industrial complex, all of this kind of plays out in terms of a kind of three-dimensional narrative, a narrative which tells a fictitious history of a town that has been built in the last 2 to 3 decades. It has a kind of extensive historical construction through plaques and patined objects, in this case the Fountain of Youth, in this case, let's say, patined or constructed post-industrial relics that were never post-industrially used, and railway lines that were never used by railways. But also the kind of programmatic theming, which is all about transporting the residents to their childhood past in their small-town American lifestyle. We see that playing out in these kind of events. We see even in the kind of advertising, which is turning the resident back to this idealized past. It's playing out in these different events that are organized by the developer. And of course, in this kind of event, you see the notion of the cheerleader. And what this tries to do, I believe, is construct an environment where the residents are actually trying to be transported into their past, to, in a way, edit out the kind of contemporary transformation of time, to produce an environment where they should feel forever young. The last one I'll talk about very briefly is the example of a kind of mutation of the American strip mall according to the logic of the hospital. In this case, when we see the American strip mall, in this case, transformed into these different programs. We see, for example, the possibility to shop in one's golf cart for chiropractor services, for aesthetic surgery, and so on. And in many ways, it's a kind of, let's say, merger of the logic of American consumerism, to which this group is very comfortable, and the kind of avoidance of the mega structure of the hospital, which has a very negative connotation to people in this particular age group. So just to close, what I would argue is that these kind of instrumentalized urbanisms demonstrate the entwinement of a kind of social realm, which is constituted by the individual and this kind of social collective, together with this kind of spatial construction. And this kind of entwinement plays out both in a material and a psychological world. And this produces also very particular situations, social situations, in the case of the villages, which are, let's say, entirely unscripted according to our assumptions for this age group, which come out of, I would argue, rather than only being blamed according to this position on, for example, a lack of sex education amongst this group, or otherwise, one of the reasons I give, a lack of sex education. They also describe the lack of pregnancy, but also the kind of extensive use of Viagra in this community has been the kind of the physician's answer to how this is actually taking place. But what I would argue is that it's actually deeply entwined with the operation of these different urban and spatial constructions. The construction of the downtown as a kind of entertainment district, which is based on this kind of nightly dancing and so on, happy hour, but also the construction of the golf cart as something which allows one to drink and drive in the context of Floridian, the Floridian setting, together with the idea that the Gulf Cut allows for this low-density suburban dream, the utopia of suburbia, to meet together with the utopia of urban amenities and urban life, which plays out in the downtown. So basically, the idea that these events that take place in this news report could not have happened, I would argue, without many of these aspects that are developed. So I think while these are deeply flawed, in many ways examples, I would also argue that they represent in this crisis of precedent, in many ways examples of necessary explorations or let's say experimentation. In many ways, I would argue that we can potentially learn a lot from them, both in what not to do, but also potentially in how they could find aspects of these different situations, could find different lives in different settings. But they also open up many other questions, which I'll finish with. The one question, of course, is the idea of, in a way, the changing characteristics and desires of different cohorts. So these examples that I've shown you from Sun City or the villages, the question becomes, what would be the settings for the spaces in which, for example, the millennials will be retiring? I think also it opens up a question of what does it mean in the context of retirement as an institution. The idea where we see, for example, the retirement age again suddenly rising, we see rather than this curve of labor participation dropping that I showed you earlier, we see actually older people becoming re-engaged in a kind of slowly transforming way with the workforce in later life. This also kind of opens up questions around, is retirement an institution that societies can afford in a potential post-growth or post-affluence area in different societies? And of course, most nation-states are asking this question, is retirement an institution that we can afford? And of course, the question is also retirement for whom, in the context of increasingly uneven distribution of resources, but also kind of geographically or geopolitically different situations in relation to this question of aging. And this last one that I showed, the last images, is also a question of the relationship of the well-being economically of older people versus working age people. And societies below this line are situations in which the old are likely to be less poor, and the line above are where the old represent a period of their lives where they're more likely to be in poverty. And I think this opens up, I think, many questions around the examples that I showed in relation to who should have access or who is allowed access to this particular utopian life. I'll finish there. Thank you. It would be nice with some questions, or I'm happy to discuss. Yeah.
Yeah, just two questions. I'm going just because we call the population. In a sense, isolation, the utopia of isolation, mainly in the US, which and I think that they are really, isolation is not just an utopia, it's a real isolation.
So it's not only utopian, but
for all people that they are really isolated. And in fact, I believe that very often without living in this, let's say, country or capital, because at least some old people that need to be going to the Salvation Army and sometimes going to university campus. And for example, I know for my experience, for example, they sometimes offer their work for free for receiving international students, for example. Kind of get involved more in the society. I mean, in this kind of isolated environments, they really become more isolated. So I didn't, I don't know, maybe the government must really get involved in trying to develop a kind of communities that are not as much isolation really being created. If you are renting that stay for a month
Yeah.
with their parents or grandparents or whatever. That's kind of the same thing they people that have become more isolated.
Yeah.
That's one part of the thing. And the other thing is that regarding all people, how does he, I mean, if part of these people, they have physical disabilities, for example, or health problems, how do they cover these costs? I mean, do they have health care payments coming from the government, or they have the private coverage, or they have to pay most of the expenses in their pockets? I mean, thinking about the developer standpoint, the developer is going to raise money for the development, so it's going to be targeting people that can really afford to living in this place.
In which context are you talking about the villages, for example, or you mean
right.
Spain, or?
Yeah, it's like in San Diego or Florida, these type of developments which are oriented to be mainly to old people.
I think it's different in different settings. Regarding the second question, I think that in a way, I mean, in an American context, you have one sort of backstop, which is the Medicare program, which is the kind of where the state plays a role, but of course you pay into it during your life, so you have a kind of backstop in that sense. And then of course many people have their own private care. I mean, that's a kind of extreme, how do you say, commodification of healthcare in the US compared to some of these other settings. It's of course quite different setting in Spain, also in relation to being a British or UK national living in Spain. You have access to Spanish health resources, but for many of these people it becomes very difficult to care for themselves when they become, let's say, less physically able to or mentally able to. So that's a little bit what I was talking about with this dystopia of denial, that for many they go there with the idea of living a good life while they're healthy, but when problems start to set in, it can become these can become extremely difficult lifestyles to maintain. I think also the RV lifestyle is very difficult, and there's many RVers who talk about this kind of trauma of having to kind of give up your keys or stop this kind of lifestyle. But regarding the first question, which I think is really important question, is about this notion of alienation and the desire for many older people who feel alienated to kind of somehow engage or become socially integrated into some kind of setting. I think what these communities try to do is to try to promote the idea of very much connecting into a very, very tailored group to your own interest and your own age group and so forth. And this becomes, let's say, the idea of promoting the notion of community as a kind of, a thing to pull people into buying these products. And for many people that I spoke to, they're extremely happy to be there. And they talk about that they're having more friends than they've ever had, that they feel extremely connected, that with these clubs that they're extraordinarily active, that for them it's a kind of extraordinary, amazing time of their lives. So in general, they talk about it, a great happiness to be in these environments, and there have been many studies that actually describe the comparative happiness of people in these retirement communities to people outside. But I think there's many complex aspects to how these surveys have been interpreted. But I think what I think is extraordinary is actually how this notion of community is trumping a larger idea of society. So in many ways, these are very much buying into products in which society is being trumped by the desires for community and the kind of larger responsibilities, for example, paying taxes into local school system or voting towards supporting a new maternity hospital. One finds a kind of double standard. So you find in Sun City a situation where Sun Cityans are voting against local schooling support and against, for example, maternity hospital funding. at the same time they expect to maintain their Medicare benefits, for example. So what it produces is a kind of fragmentation, I would argue, into a series of kind of really problematic seceding sort of sub-societies. And I think that's one very problematic aspect of this idea. But of course, within those sub-societies, people describe themselves being extremely happy and satisfied. I mean, there's other discussions that come from sociologists who say that in those surveys they're unwilling to admit that they got it wrong. So they're all saying everything is great, even though it's not necessarily that good. But that's a whole other discussion. But I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, somehow. Yes, the thing is that the US also is a very large country, and culturally speaking, it's they have their own culture. Country. I haven't been in any country in Europe, but also in terms of England or whatever.
But I think
and all people they get to be close to their relatives somehow. But in the US, once you are 18, you get into school. It's not one thing that you decide. So it's there's some cultural issues that we get to place here. In addition to state countries, very large countries, and infrastructure, infrastructure everywhere.
Yeah.
Even anyone in the country. But in Europe, in a 2-hour drive, you can go
Perdón por la interrupción, quiero pedirles que circulemos el micrófono que está por ahí, que no se pierda, y para que también hagamos que vuelva, por favor, y que lo pasemos y que hagamos preguntas, tratemos de hacer preguntas cortas para que pueda participar mucha gente. ¿Sí? Just trying to distribute the ball.
Yeah.
Deane, I was.
Yeah.
Can I ask you? I was wondering if you think that this utopia that you're actually talking about, it's like a generic utopia. Like it feels like it doesn't have a quality to the utopia itself. Like it's a very generic kind of walled up setting. And well, the first thing was if you think that is actually what is happening, and why do you think it's like that? And I was wondering if when you were showing in Spain where the urbanization was more Mediterranean and then the actual building types were more British or other typologies that were not local, if that is why like design is separated somehow, and that is why the mechanism of adaptation it's like, I don't know if Spanish architects are designing the landscape like a generic landscape in terms of Mediterranean generic, and then the British architect is designing a generic mini Britain on top of that, or what are the mechanisms of design regarding that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. It seems to me anyway that in the Spanish context, what is sort of happening, I think, is that it's very much following this idea of a, as you say, generic product around a relationship between a certain vision of a Spanish indigenous architecture of that particular region, together with all of the, let's say, typical recreational spatial protocols that go with that, including golfing, including specific way that the swimming pool is related. And it comes, I think, to a certain extent out of the tradition of the first kind of wave of, let's say, tourism, mass tourism that took place in Costa del Sol from the 70s and 80s. And some of the social scientists who've been doing work on retirees there have been talking about the idea that for many of these permanent residents now, they discovered this area as tourists in the 80s or 90s and fell in love with these areas and decided that they wanted to retire. And in a way, there's a kind of smooth transition from a kind of logic of tourism into the idea of the permanent retirement migration. And both in the kind of tropes of the architecture, in this idea that you could still be a British tourist and hang out in the British pub watching the FA Cup semi-final, and at the same time you could be there. And that's attached, of course, to the beach system, to the infrastructure of the airport, of the budget airlines, of all of this, which both supports touristic logic, which came first, and supports the second wave of this. So I think very much it's really about a generic system that is not only used in that context, but is also something repeated internationally. So there's many similarities with the American gated retirement communities to Costa del Sol, but also to communities that are emerging in Turkey, in Bulgaria, in Thailand. One sees many of these. So I very much agree that there's a kind of formulaic aspect, there's a kind of calculus to this which plays out. And of course there are differences, there are many subtle and weird quirky things that go on that you can pick up, but I think that's dominant. Yeah.
I had a question.
Yeah.
I think as these projects were tailored around the retirement and also the parameters of the demographic parameters changing, how sustainable would this project be in the future as the younger generations decrease and the possibility of a retirement and the relationship between an older growing generation demanding a retirement and pension and a younger working generation decreasing could affect these urbanizations in the sense that if they would be able to continue to accept to be just a retired community, or if in this urbanization we would have to start to change the demographic homogeneity.
Yep, I think I'll just go back to this slide. I mean, I think that this is a huge question of both what will be built in the future, but also I think the big question is what will happen to this huge amount of existing urban fabric that exists around the world when we have a kind of course, transformed situation both demographically, but also I think particularly economically. When in a situation where it's likely that we will be less and less able to afford to retire as a kind of broad society or set of nations. I mean, it's of course different between different nations, but it becomes increasingly an issue. Is retirement a kind of a moment, a dream of the late 20th century, a kind of affluent moment? So I think that's the kind of question, of course, about this sort of shift back toward all the people working, but also very much about who will want to live in these environments and what will be the ways in which we will have to transform them to make them relevant or abandon them. So I think that there are a lot of kind of interesting issues in your question. For example, questions about what has been referred to in some contexts as generational warfare, or a kind of contestation over resources between generations, which of course we've seen in recent decades a kind of concentration of resources amongst the older generations. This is kind of a clear movement. We see also, I mean, of course, in contexts like this, very specific instrumental urbanism directed only towards one particular group and not necessarily another. So I think that there are definitely huge and interesting challenges to think about how to address those changes. Yeah.
Could architecturally absorb like new demographic because they were thought for like golf cars and like it's tailored for just one demographic. It's not an urbanization design or project for like different demographic.
Yeah, I mean, I think that places like the villages, which is designed largely around leisure and consumption, will require quite a lot of work to turn it into a place of production or of other things. But I think that it's not ruling out that would not be possible. I think that it requires some thinking about what kind of scenarios would play out in terms of a longer-term situation in which maybe there's simply not all the people interested in living like that anymore in 50 years' time. But what does that mean in terms of who owns those properties? What are the kind of potentials to live there or find work there for people in working age when the largest kind of work base is an hour and a half away by car? So I think it raises a lot of questions about what kind of future such a place would have as a kind of mixed demographic space. I think it would be super interesting to play out. I think that's one of the big challenges is exactly this question you have. What will happen when, for example, your generation, even the late baby boomers, who have quite different sets of desires and quite different personal histories and biographies that have been informed by quite different events from the previous generation or the Eisenhower generation or earlier, which has been much more, let's say, less individualized, more organized around kind of collective structured pursuits, whereas we see a kind of shift with the baby boomers more and more towards individualization and kind of more small scale developments. Yeah, but that's a long story.
I wanted to address what you just mentioned right now at the end of the talk. I thought it was very interesting how you show that these people live in a historical utopia from the 60s. They live in a sort of underground city or the suburban American country. And if you see this shift towards urbanity as new people get old, and or if you see right now something changing.
Yeah, I think so. I think there are interesting things starting to happen. I think that one thing that's starting to happen and it's been growing in the last 18 years is an interest much more for people not to want to move far away from the places where they live. And this is quite for the example of the US, this is quite a radical change where, for example, Del Webb is one of the large manufacturers of homes. It was a developer in Sun City. They did a survey where I think in the early 2000s, they had quite a high number, more than half of people in their early 50s were anticipating that they would buy a new home and would move somewhere more than, I don't know if it's 50 or 100 kilometers away from their home to find a better situation suiting their new retired life. I think something like 10 years later, and I don't know all the figures in my head, this number had dropped considerably, where people were much more interested in living closer and maintaining their social networks from before. And I think we can connect that to this, let's say, emerging orthodoxy around aging in place as a predominant response, at least in the European context, which has kind of two conveniences. One is that it's, of course, a response to institutional fatigue in the 60s and 70s to avoid going into institutions. And at the same time, it's economic convenience because it's much less expensive to care for ailing older people in their own homes compared to having them in other kinds of state-supported institutions, private institutions. So these two things meet into a kind of political, economic, and sort of socio-cultural drive to push things into place. And I think that, in a way, this is having different outcomes. Also, we see less tendency toward desiring these big communities and more toward the idea of small communities also that fit particular interest groups. For example, small communities that are for retirees of a particular university, or small communities, for example, one in Los Angeles, which is for people interested in art and theater, which is maybe, I think, around 40 or 50 units connected to spaces that are studios and so on. So smaller groups of like interests, even there are some that are ethnically defined groups of Asian American citizens who have made small communities together and so on. So I think this is something that's happening is much smaller and more specific interest-based groups. And then we see also a kind of renewed interest in the multi-generational family for different reasons. So I think it's becoming, I believe, much more diverse landscape and becoming, let's say, at the same time, increasingly challenging around the orthodoxy associated with aging in place. So what I believe is that aging in place is kind of presented as a silver bullet in relation to this kind kind of situation. But what I believe is that it doesn't, let's say, respond to all of the challenges that make people take these environments in the first place. And that's to do with all of the challenges around alienation, isolation, to do with also the whole problem that, for example, people move more and more these days, so the whole idea of social network has a different meaning to different locations where people are much more sedentary. It's all about also the challenges of trying to maintain very large homes. We want to be physically or economically to maintain. So I think it's immensely complex, particularly in low-density environments like suburban or ex-urban settings, where you find older people extremely isolated in single-family homes, no longer able to drive, with very little amenities or services around them, such as supermarkets, such as spaces to meet friends, let's say club spaces, anything recreational spaces. So I think this is a huge challenge which is not really addressed in the kind of euphoria around aging in place as the kind of answer. And I think it has many advantages, and I think that at the moment is one of the best options we have, but I think it's extremely filled with challenges.
Yes, I was thinking about how interesting it becomes when you strip out or strip layer of labor and productivity. It becomes uncanny. Like it could be like sort of exemplary model in which one could create cities in general, like finding these places, and it's interesting also how it becomes so evident its kind of falseness. I mean, I was wondering about this, if you found during your research any evidence of riots in these communities. I've seen they are making some kind of, not all, I think the RVs may be different, but some of them they're making some kind of pact, like where the life is being fully planned, and there's there's no availability of the employable. So I was wondering if that as a consequence has a riot or some sort of disturbance, or if there is no energy left at that age to make that.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, my experience is that people in these kind of communities have a lot of energy to complain. There's a lot of kind of power behind the desire to correct the wrongs that have been done. And I think that in a place like the villages, it's quite interesting because there's a really distorted idea of how the media plays out. And all the local media, as I mentioned, is dominated by the owners. But there's a group that is quite active in critiquing a lot of the, let's say, problematic aspects of this private governance in the villages, where they're using the net to kind of as a platform to do that. And they are quite critical of things that where the developer builds a golf course for $3 million and sells it to themselves through another organization for $15 million, and then the residents of the long-term bonds have to pay back the difference. And it's all kind of buried. So they've been exposing these kind of things and have been, for example, I believe there have been small pickets and some sort of demonstrations, but I wouldn't say riot would be the right word to describe it. But I mean, maybe it will come to that, and I think it would be very interesting to sort of follow.
It's interesting because maybe if they go too far, they'll lose everything. They will lose their it will be some kind of emancipation. Like they will turn down that system that is holding them, and they will have to find
they'll get
new
kicked out of the
solutions.
villages, for example.
Or the village will like collapse in its own way.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's starting to be more and more concern over the environmental issues. I mean, I think when people see half of their front lawn disappear into the ground, they start to sort of get concerned, and this is happening more, and the developers try to kind of keep this discussion down. But I think that there are realizations that there are severe challenges to address, and I think people are quite concerned if that's going to happen to them. We need to kind of, let's say, be more aware of these issues. I think also people are starting to become more aware through the mass media, where there have been a series of profiles, for example, on the developers of the villages in national newspapers and national television. Some of these have been focusing, for example, on the golf cart as a kind of novelty piece, but some of them have been looking at this sexually transmitted infection discussion as a sort of another kind of novelty, but others have been looking at this idea of a kind of corruption in a way. Or sort of, I mean, also this Gary Moss guy, who recently died, he's also been under huge investigations for tax evasion, and there's big kind of discussions about that as well. So maybe the writers will come.
I have a question. Can you say something about the system of that you developed? Okay.
I want to ask you about the drawings of the book and the system of representation that you developed for different urban textures and the object. And if you can say something about how and why, and whether those drawings are meant to merely describe a situation, or they have some kind of agenda in terms of digging or intervening or suggesting something that's not there.
Yeah. That's a good question. I think the techniques of representation were in a way to try to, let's say, within a discussion around the kind of text part of the book. I was describing earlier today about this book is made of two parts. One is a kind of more textual part, the other is a more drawn part. So the text part is the slow book and the drawn part is the fast book. So in a way it was to try to both make the material that is written about and discussed more accessible and present and accessible in the context of reading. But it's also, the intention is to make it much more intuitively understandable. So the idea, I guess, of the picture tells 1,000 words is the kind of intention of also the drawings. And the idea, in a way, was my own interest in this kind of, how to say, fluidity between scales, between discussing this as a kind of urban phenomenon, to discussing it as a kind of architectural, to a kind of design phenomenon. And this, for example, in these drawings was to see this as a kind of zoom from a very large, how do you say, kind of territorial, geographical condition into where, through this kind of zoom in and scale, could kind of start to dissect different levels. And these sort of dissection drawings were about trying to, how do you say, unfold and describe these specific things that for me were evident after sort of trying to understand these super complex environments. You know, like how to use a drawing to communicate quite clearly what one can start to understand through both kind of theoretical lens and through the lens of observing and trying to understand the different backgrounds, economic, demographic, and so on, and how this in a way contributes to a spatial situation. So I guess the interest was to use the tools of the architect to try to materialize these sites that otherwise one would be looking at through Google Earth or Google Street View, or that in a way they become the documents that are the evidence for the discussion in the book. I mean, we can talk about other specific things. I mean, the idea, for example, of the color scheme was to talk about programmatic understanding of these environments. So I was very interested in the idea of discussing these as urban infrastructures of leisure. So the idea of seeing the relationship between housing and different kinds of leisure and commercial infrastructures. So that was kind of the idea of taking the colors as a way of starting to speak about a kind of reprogramming of the city, that if we were looking at another kind of city, we would see much more, how to say, productive rather than consumptive space. And that would reflect, I think, a kind of color scheme. So that was a kind of idea about the colors. I mean, there was, of course, the idea of using tools like comparative representation to look at how one could see, for example, the relationship between these different lifestyles, the idea also of understanding objects as being emblematic and kind of encapsulating these complex conditions, from the idea of cultural identity to the idea of cultural aspiration, and so on and so on. So it was to try to kind of put together a set of documents that become a tool to both communicate and understand.
When did you use the framework of utopia and dystopia to frame the research?
When?
Why? I mean, that obviously it has certain appropriateness, but also it's a very deliberate disciplinary instrument.
Yeah.
So what's the disciplinary agenda behind that?
Well, I think, it came out of, let's say, being interested in a discussion of utopia not only as a kind of the non-place discussion, but moving it more into a kind of performative utopian discourse. So the idea also that trying to connect this idea of the discourse around the Third Age and the Young Old, which is centered around this idea of late freedom, the kind of ideal age in which one reaches the moment where one can have the vacation that never ends, the idea that one could have, that this freedom is a kind of construct with which, when I was looking at these places, to me it was very much about having a freedom and a new lack of responsibility to actually materialize these kind of utopian ambitions, or you could call it desire for a better life, a good life. And to me, I think it became interesting because of a discussion also of utopia as this kind of flip side, that it became a way to talk about both the personal utopia, but the societal dystopia, and so on. But I think for me that it became more interesting than, for example, only discussing this in a kind of heterotopian discourse, or only discussing it in terms of the dream of a better housing product or an urban product. So to me, it somehow became productive as a way of, let's say, linking it also to the archigram work, to other kinds of resonances of utopias. For example, the utopia of the American frontier, the kind of utopia of the technological Arcadia of archigram, and so on. There's a kind of dialogue where I'm interested also in the idea that some of these 60s and 70s utopias are constructed by the same cohort that is now retired. So the idea that as youth they dreamt it, and as retirees they tried to produce it. I think there's something kind of interesting also about this discussion. That the boomers are the ones who have achieved individualization, and they have achieved the potential for self-fulfillment and personal, how do you say? So I think it links to a lot of different discussions. But of course it's tricky for the utopian discourse. It's difficult to manage.
It's also the other reference that is often in the work is the reference to Venturi.
Yeah.
But it's also not so, it's kind of not so explicit. I mean, you can see it, but even today you didn't talk about that in the presentation.
Yeah.
And you only mentioned it upstairs at some point.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if there is I don't know, that happened just because it was a casual coincidence, or there is a certain problem in the relationship of the work with pop culture in the 60s that you cannot handle, or you know?
Yeah. No, I'm extremely interested in and indebted to Venturi, Scott Brown, and Eason on Learning from Las Vegas and this whole discussion of, let's say, looking non-judgmentally at kind of real condition that is not necessarily produced by architects or is canonized as architectural work. For me also, I'm interested in the methods of documentation that they developed, the Noli plans around parking lots and different techniques, which I think for me are extremely inspirational around how one can develop a method of communication or a media that relates to a specific context. So for me, I think all of that is interesting. I mean, I think that I guess my plan was to talk a little bit about Venturi tomorrow, but I mean, I think in a way what I would say is that I mean I'm less interested in the discourse around pop in relation to this than I am the relationship of this to a discussion, for example, of segmentation and spatial products. And I think that this idea of for example, the American popular vocabulary of the strip, for example, I think in a way it's something that I talk about in the book, but I think it becomes somehow limiting to, I don't know, for me it became a tool in discussion. The discussion of pop was not a tool to me that seemed that useful. For example, I found it more useful in the context of the Japanese discussion to talk about, for example, the discussion of simulation or discussion of cultural, how do you say, appropriation, to talk about, let's say, other aspects. And I think that for me the discussion of pop is somehow limiting. And I think it's one, of course, it's one dimension of these things, that of course these are popular architectures in a way. So I guess, I don't know, maybe for me, I don't make it so explicit or go further with the pop discussion, because to me it didn't seem so productive. But maybe you found a way to...
No, for now I was just curious.
Yeah. Maybe I can talk a little bit more about it tomorrow.
Okay, maybe we can have one more, and then we have to finish. Maybe the students sitting behind.
Yeah.
Some I know are reading the videos we are right now, so maybe they can short circuit some ideas.
Is that an amount over there, or that's a it's for circulation.
Like the cat.
Otherwise, maybe